or at least until the power fails during the zombie apocalypse. I'm your host here on Theology Unleashed. My name is Josh Wolf, and I'm here to host a discussion/debate for and against the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And we have two great guests today who have joined us to debate for and against this proposition. We got Maverick Christian in the green corner and David Pallmann in the purple corner. I'm choosing purple and green rather than red and blue because they're kind of overloaded terms. But Maverick is going to be presenting the for case. David is going to be presenting the against case. And gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let me give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves to the viewers of the stream who may or may not be familiar with you already before we get into the substance of today's argument. Maverick, you're going to be speaking first. Do you want to take the first introduction?
Sure. I got a YouTube channel called Maverick Christian. Talk about philosophy stuff, usually apologetics oriented, like atheism versus theism stuff. I'm a philosophy student right now. Hope to get a degree in philosophy pretty soon here and then move on to graduate school. Try to get a graduate degree in philosophy.
Epic. Thanks for joining us today. And David, over to you.
Yeah, my YouTube channel is called Faith Because of Reason. I also do apologetic content, but also theology, exegesis, and a little bit of epistemology and philosophy of religion. But mostly apologetics. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. And so now to the topic of today's debate. We're going to have opening statements, 10 to 15 minutes if that works for you, and then like interlocution discussion around the points that have been raised. So over to you, Maverick Christian, to set the scene, the context, explain it to me like I'm five. I'm sure both of you are very familiar with the subject matter, and many of our viewers are, and there'll be some who are not, like me. So I'm looking forward to finding out what it's all about. Maverick Christian, over to you.
All right. I'll see if I can set up the slideshow here. All right. You see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay,
it's about to come on. Here we go. Yep, we got your screen now.
All right. All right. Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. So, introduce some terminology here. Defeater is roughly that's something that removes or weakens irrational grounds for accepting some belief. So, in the context of the evolutionary argument against naturalism, it's something that one where is actually obligated to withhold the belief, like not believe it as by remaining agnostic about it or believing it to be false. So here's an example. Suppose I drive and I see what appears to be a barn from 50 meters away. I later learned that some eccentric last week has put up barn facades all over the area along with real ones, and that these fake barns are indistinguishable from real barns when viewed at a distance of 30 meters or more. Now I have a defeater for my belief that I had seen a barn. So more precisely, a belief D is something that defeats another belief B for someone if that person no longer be justified in believing B when coming to believe, continuing to believe D. So in this case, my belief, that's a fine barn. My defeater is barn facades been put up in this area that are indistinguishable from real barns. I'm no longer in a rational position to believe that's a fine barn anymore because it could be a fake one. All right, so the symbolism for the argument here, R is our cognitive faculties are reliable. The top of reliability here is such that not reliable means that you can't even trust your cognitive faculties to know that scientists exist. So imagine someone dreaming when they don't know that they're dreaming. They typically don't have reliable cognitive faculties with respect to what's going on around them. So it's that type of unreliability the argument is concerned with. And is naturalism, there's nothing supernatural, and E is the theory of evolution. But here it is in a nutshell. The likelihood that our cognitive faculties are reliable given N and E is low. That's a probability thesis. The defeater thesis that anyone who believes N and E and believes that PR given N and E is low has a defeater for R. Anyone has a defeater for R has a defeater for pretty much any other belief she thinks she has, including naturalism and evolution itself. If 1 and 3 are true, then N and E is self-defeating. Conclusion, N and E is self-defeating. So the real controversial premises here are the probability thesis and the defeater thesis. So I'll give an argument for the defeater thesis here. So imagine we have a drug that has a high probability of rendering one's cognitive faculties unreliable within 2 hours of ingestion. The minority who are immune to the drug have a blocking gene, coding for a protein that blocks the drug's effects, and the XX mutation, and the scenarios we'll talk about here, is a mutation that injects drug XX into the bloodstream soon after one is born. So here are the scenarios. One is Sam ingest drug XX. Now, Sam believes he has the block. 24 hours after Sam took drug XX, he believes that a doctor called him saying that he has the blocking gene. But since I know this belief came long after Sam ingested drug XX, and I have no independent reason for thinking Sam is correct here, I have a defeater for thinking that Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable. The second scenario is where suppose I ingest drug XX. Now, I have and 12 hours later, and I have a defeater for my cognitive faculties are unreliable because that's highly probable that drug gave me that. Now, suppose 24 hours later, I come to believe that a doctor called me thinking I had the blocking gene. Well, since that call allegedly took place long after the drug XX took effect, if it took effect, I'm epistemically screwed, so to speak. And so I don't have I'm no longer rational in believing that I have reliable cognitive faculties thanks to the drug. And basically kind of goes down line from here. Suppose I come to believe a doctor ingested me with the drug XX as an infant. S4 is where I believe I have the XX mutation. The fifth scenario is suppose through a nifty feat of philosophical and scientific argumentation, it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt that entity entails the XX mutation, rendering P given R given N and E is low. It seems then I would have a defeater for my cognitive faculties are reliable. And scenario S6, that's basically the same thing. And the argument here is that there's no relevant differences between one scenario and the other, whereby R is defeated in one but not the other. That's the general argument for the defeater thesis. And some terminology here. So logically impossible, to oversimplify it, is basically anything that's self-contradictory in the way that it's impossible along the lines of mathematics and logic, like largest prime number, that's logically impossible. So anything not self-contradictory is logically possible. An argument is logically valid if it's logically impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. A possible world is a complete description of the way the world is or could have been like. Metaphysically impossible means a proposition is true in no possible. Impossible means it's not true in any possible world. So some things are not self-contradictory, may still be metaphysically impossible. Like one might think it's morally permissible to torture infants just for fun. It's metaphysically impossible. A priori knowledge means know on the basis of pure deduction as opposed to observation, like mathematical truths and all bachelors unmarried. A posteriori knowledge is known on the basis of observations, like the shape of the earth. Conceivable is what cannot be ruled out a priori. And so, an example, it's conceivable that water is not identical to H2O. We know of water long before we discovered water's chemical composition. Water's chemical composition was an empirical discovery. Water not being identical to H2O could not be ruled out a priori because water's identity is an a posteriori fact. We need observation to do that. So some people believe water is identical to H2O is metaphysically necessary, even though it's conceivably false, because we couldn't rule out a priori. And supervenience. X supervenes on Y if and only if there cannot be a difference in X without a difference in Y. So, for example, some people think that mental states supervene on brain states. There can't be a difference in mental states without there being difference in brain states. So very roughly, brain states determine mental states on this field. Strong supervenience is supervenience that holds in all possible worlds. That's metaphysically necessary. And epistemic probability, as used here, refers to the objective evidential relations among propositions. For example, there's an objective fact of the matter where the scientific evidence makes the theory of evolution highly probable. And in this argument, a mental state is the inner aspects of one's mind as it pro tanto pertains to sense experiences, thoughts, feelings, and so forth. Such that mental states are the collection of that pro tanto internal mental phenomena that one's neurophysiology, like brain state, produces, at least if naturalism and contemporary science are correct about such matters. An accurate mental state is one that accurately reflects one's world in a way that is necessary for reliable cognitive faculties. And a garbage mental state is a mental state that diverges wildly from one's external environment, as in dreams, resulting in unreliable cognitive faculties, effectively living in a dream world. So note that with respect to conceivable mental states of human-like complexity, garbage mental states vastly outnumber accurate ones. So think of an example. Dreams when you don't know that you're dreaming. When you're lying in bed and dreaming, you usually don't dream of lying in bed. All right, so back to the probability thesis. So in this case, I'm using epistemic probability. Basically, given just naturalism and evolution, it's epistemically likely that we don't have reliable cognitive faculties. So more specifically, I think it's epistemically likely, given N and E, that we would have garbage mental states, effectively living in a dream world. So an obvious objection is, would organisms with reliable cognitive faculties be more likely to survive and reproduce than if their mental states were absolute garbage? And it's not necessarily true thanks to the naturalistic mental states theorems. And so this debate is based off of a draft of a paper I wrote. All right, so physical laws under this theorem is stipulatively defined as a certain outcome at the level of physics and chemistry will obtain if certain conditions, C, at the level of physics and chemistry obtain in the absence of supernatural intervention. So given certain conditions, we'll get this outcome in the absence of supernatural intervention. So pretty close to the standard definition of a physical law. So physical state, and it is simply defined here as the conjunction of physical laws and physical conditions. And the theorem simplified says that given naturalism, no matter which logically possible mental state associations obtained for a given physical state, the resulting outcome from that physical state would be the same. So in this way, mental states are effectively epiphenomenal on naturalism. So that means, for example, that given a physical state of evolving organisms, whether they have accurate mental states or dreamlike garbage mental states would not affect the behavior of these organisms. They behave the same either way. And recall that when it comes to conceivable mental states, dreamlike garbage mental states massively outnumber those that accurately resemble one's external reality. And so this is a major reason why the probability thesis is true, is because mental states are effectively epiphenomenal in that way. So the proof is kind of complicated, but I give kind of a rough picture, a rough sketch of the reasoning behind the theorem's proof here. So imagine we have the same physical state, that is the same physical conditions, same physical laws, but a different mental state associated with the brain. Would the outcome be any different on naturalism? Well, no, because we have the same physical laws and the same physical conditions, the same outcome would result. So it really wouldn't matter which mental state the brain's electrochemical reactions result from that mental state. Given the same physical state, the electrochemical reactions could produce really any mental state at all, and it wouldn't matter. The behavior will be the same thanks to these theorems. So on naturalism, no matter which logically possible mental state association obtained for a physical state, that is physical laws plus physical conditions, the same outcome would result. So in this case, mental states are effectively epiphenomenal on naturalism. And again, given a physical state involving organisms where they have accurate mental states or dreamlike garbage mental states would not affect the behavior of these organisms. They behave the same either way. And when it comes to conceivable mental states, dreamlike garbage mental states massively outnumber those that accurately resemble one's external reality. And that's the major reason why the probability thesis is true. To put a little bit more concretely, and to help remove bias against our own species and ignore relevant distractions, imagine there are aliens who are much like us and that they can form beliefs, change beliefs, etc., and their mental states have the same complexities that of a normal adult human. This is part of the alien scenario here. Now, in our scenario, our a posteriori knowledge, as it were, is limited to things like the universe fitting the formal model the NMS theorems use, like the universe has physical laws and physical conditions. Naturalism and evolution being true, for the aliens, there's little other background knowledge beyond what we know a priori. So again, a posteriori is what we require experience, and a priori is basically like mathematical truths and stuff like that. So imagine RA is the cognitive faculties of the aliens are reliable. And the probability of R given AS is symbolized this way. And now we're going to try to evaluate the probability of R given entity. That is basically the probability of RA given just entity. Almost all posteriori knowledge is excluded from AS apart from entity. So what can we conclude here? Oh, yeah, the idea here is that with respect to the probability, if R is defeated for the aliens, then the alien scenario is defeated here in the kind of the normal human scenario. Since in both cases, we're basically considering the probability of cognitive reliability on just entity. We're considering the alien probability thesis to help avoid bias towards our own species and ignore irrelevant distractions. So why I think the alien probability thesis is true. Line 35 here. Well, mental states are effectively phenomenal in the sense that the theorems established that is, no matter which conceivable mental state associations obtained for a given physical state, that physical state's outcome would be the same. Vis-a-vis conceivable mental states, garbage mental states vastly outnumber those that accurately resemble one's external reality. And we have no a priori reason to believe an alien would have an accurate mental state instead of far more numerous garbage mental states. Again, a priori is just stuff like mathematical truths. We can't rule it out a priori. Now, ordinarily, we'd be able to rule it out through a posteriori means, but thanks to mental states being effectively phenomenal, again, those mental state, given a physical state, the mental state association could be anything, and it wouldn't matter, would not affect the organism's behavior at all. Entity being true for the aliens is not a posteriori reason to believe an alien would have an accurate mental state instead of one of the far more numerous garbage mental states. And if this premise says basically the above four premises create an inductively strong argument that the aliens have unreliable cognitive faculties given just the information in the alien scenario. And if it's epistemically likely that the aliens probably have unreliable cognitive faculties given just the information in the alien scenario, the alien probability thesis is low, which is true by definition, because the alien probability thesis is basically what is the probability that the aliens have reliable cognitive faculties given basically just entity and nothing else. And so with factors like the NMS theorems implying that mental states are effectively epiphenomenal in naturalism and garbage mental states vastly outnumbering accurate ones, all things considered, a low P of R given N and E, and by extension a low P of R given N and E seems difficult to successfully avoid when using epistemic probability. Because again, epistemic probability is just the probability of objective evidential relations. And yeah, I guess that'll do it.
Okay, epic opening statement there. I don't know if that was quite explain it like I'm five. I did grab a bunch of stuff in there. And the other thing I really appreciated was it was like, I'm a computer programmer by background. It was like going to a functional programming talk. Like no matter how many of them I go to, I start off going like, this is awesome. And then by about 10 minutes in, I'm like, I have no idea what he's talking about. And I'm sure that for anyone else who's following along out there, this is a bit of a stretch, and it's going to get further kind of elucidated and kind of extricated by David in this next part here and in the discussion that follows. So thank you, Maverick Christian, and over to you, David, for your opening statement.
All right, thanks so much. So let me just kind of say up front that this is not my area of expertise by a long shot, and that one reason that I kind of requested that this would be formatted as a discussion rather than a debate is just that it's not something that I've given near the amount of study to as Maverick has, and so I just wanted to state that up front. However, I am skeptical of the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Now, I'm willing to be convinced because as an evangelical Christian, my worldview would remain relatively intact were I convinced that this was a sound argument. So my skepticism of the evolutionary argument against naturalism does not spring from any desire to preserve naturalism. I simply feel that it's not a successful argument on its own terms. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm actually going to forego the debate whether or not the reliability of cognitive faculties is likely low given naturalistic evolution. I'm not entirely convinced that naturalistic evolution does entail a low probability here, but for the sake of this debate, I'm willing to assume that it is. My skepticism about the argument is rather at a deeper level. I think that the crucial question we need to answer is this. Does the fact that naturalism entails a low probability that one's cognitive faculties are reliable provide a defeater for rational belief in naturalism? It seems to me that the answer is not necessarily. We need to examine why it is that someone would think that this fact provides a looming defeater. So Plantinga and Maverick argue for this by means of analogies, and perhaps the most common analogy that they use is the double X pill analogy. So Plantinga explains this in Where the Conflict Really Lies. He writes, suppose there's a drug, call it XX, destroys cognitive reliability. I know that 95% of those who ingest XX become unreliable within 2 hours of it. Suppose further that I've ingested XX a couple of hours ago, and that PR I've ingested XX a couple ago is low. Taken together, these two beliefs give me a defeater for my initial belief that my cognitive faculties are reliable. Furthermore, I can't appeal to any of my other beliefs to show or argue that my cognitive faculties are still reliable. Any such other belief, B, is a product of my cognitive faculties. But then in recognizing this and having a defeater for R, I also have a defeater for B. Now, the problem I have with analogies is that we're never told what the phenomenology is for someone who has ingested XX, suffering from the resultant cognitive unreliability. There are kind of two possibilities with regard to the extent of that cognitive unreliability. It could be either local or it could be global. So let's say that the cognitive unreliability was local. Perhaps XX makes people, let's just say, see red bumps on their body that aren't actually there. Well, if I've taken XX and I do not see any red bumps on my body, then I know with full assurance that I'm in the 5% of people who are not suffering from cognitive malfunction, precisely because I have a distinct phenomenology from those who are affected negatively. Now, this is the same sort of reasoning that I would use to conclude that, for example, although the vast majority of people who were born in January of 1998 had brown eyes, I would still reason that my eyes are nonetheless blue. No matter how low the probability is, one can be rational in believing something with a low probability is true on the basis of sufficient evidence. So it seems to me that if the proponent of the XX analogy intends for us to think that there is local unreliability, then once the extent of that unreliability has been specified, it should be relatively easy for anyone who has taken the drug to determine that they're not suffering from the effects of it, if in fact they are not. But what if the XX drug case has a global unreliability? What if it affects us in the way that like a Cartesian evil demon is supposed to, by making us see a three-dimensional world that does not in fact match reality? Well, certainly that would destroy our ability to know if we are in the no longer clear that that hypothetical is any longer analogous to believing that the probability of naturalistic evolution produces reliable cognitive faculties is low. We're being asked to believe that evolution constructed us in such a way that we experience a streamlined, coherent world which does not match the external reality, but nonetheless benefits our survival. Now, that's a very difficult idea to seriously entertain, for it's not at all clear how such experiences would benefit one's survival. On the contrary, such a constant delusional experience would seem to prove deleterious to one's survival. So kind of here we appear to be a dilemma. The analogy to demonstrate that accepting that naturalistic evolution is unlikely to produce reliable cognitive faculties thereby provides a defeater for believing in naturalistic evolution. The phenomenology in these analogies must be like or unlike our own. If the phenomenology is unlike our own, then we can easily conclude that we have beaten the odds. If it is not like our own, or rather if it is like our own, then it needs to be shown that this could be done in such a way that is compatible with our survival being enhanced. Otherwise, the analogy is no longer analogous. Beliefs about the justificatory status of beliefs such as that of one's cognitive reliabilities, or rather the reliability of one's cognitive faculties, has sort of a logical priority over the justificatory status of beliefs about the probability of any given thing within some particular metaphysical worldview, such as naturalism. Whatever means we use to determine that a theory such as evolution is true will depend upon the belief that we have reliable cognitive faculties. And hence it seems to me that any belief about evolution, or what it might entail under any given worldview, cannot even be assessed unless one has already justified their belief that their cognitive faculties are reliable. We must not put the metaphysical cart before the epistemological horse. So if we can determine that we have reliable cognitive faculties on independent grounds, then we would also have, and theoretically, if we also had good reasons for believing in naturalism, and again, I'm not saying that we do, then it seems that, at least in principle, there could be a case that even if naturalistic evolution is unlikely to have given us reliable cognitive faculties, one could nonetheless still be justified in believing that naturalistic evolution had given them reliable cognitive faculties. So those are my nowhere near indicated question rebuttals. I am, but that's the source of some of my skepticism about the argument.
So with regards to the idea that if we had, for example, garbage mental states, it would be deleterious. That's kind of obviated by the naturalistic mental states theorem, because what that says is that given a physical state, no matter which logically possible mental state association obtained for that physical state, the same outcome would result. So even if those, given a physical state, the electrochemical reactions of the brain produce something like absolute garbage, like basically in the dream world, it wouldn't affect the behavior at all. And as far as the defeater thesis goes, so I gave a logically valid argument. I'm curious which premise of that argument you reject.
Could you repeat that argument?
All 35 points of it, please.
All right. So it's the idea, it was an argument from analogy, but there were like a series of 6 analogies. it's like if R is defeated in one, then R is defeated. If R is defeated in one, then R is defeated in the other. So I could share my screen again to kind of summarize those analogies here. All right,
might just take a second to come up here.
Yeah.
Here we go.
All right. And here we go. So where is R? R is presumably defeated in the first scenario. That's the one where Sam's cognitive faculties are initially believed to be reliable, but later I learned that Sam ingested drug XX that days after the ingestion. Sam can't believe a doctor has called him informing that he has the blocking gene, that he has passed cognitive reliability test, but I have no independent reason for thinking Sam's belief about the alleged doctor call is accurate. And since this belief of Sam's comes days after he ingests drug X, I conclude that Sam's belief was likely the product of unreliable cognitive faculties. And so it seems that R is defeated for Sam here.
Just so I can clarify that point, Maverick, you're saying that Sam drops a massive tab of acid, and then after he's taken it, he's like, I think I didn't take it. Did I take it? No, I didn't take it.
No, Sam believes he ingested drug XX, but later he believes he had a doctor call. Yeah. But remind you, the drug takes effect, if it takes effect, within 2 hours of ingestion. Okay. So days after that, he believes he's got a call from the doctor saying, good news, Sam, you have the blocking gene, so you're immune from the drug. However, because now I don't have any independent reason for thinking this doctor call occurred.
So he could have hallucinated that, right?
Yeah, he could have hallucinated that or something. And because I know that Sam's belief came in long after the drug XX was ingested, I conclude that Sam's belief that he had the doctor call was probably a product of unreliable cognitive faculties. So it seems that my belief that Sam's
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, I'm curious what then the phenomenology is here. So what is the state of a person who ingests this drug?
That their cognitive faculties are unreliable. Beyond that, it's unspecified.
In what way? I need it to be specified.
So, I mean, it's not reliable. Like something, so for an example of a type of unreliability would be that you couldn't even rely on your cognitive faculties to know that scientists exist, or that you live in a house, or stuff like that. So a severe type of unreliability.
Right, and so is this like is this globally that a person is like living effectively in a world created by a Cartesian demon? We're talking about a global unreliability as opposed to just sort of a. Okay.
Yeah.
So then my objection there is it's not clear to me. Right. So my objection here would be that it doesn't seem to me that believing that you are in a matrix-like world on the or believing that you've taken a pill that would that had a high probability of putting you in that kind of situation is in any sense analogous to believing that the probability is low given naturalism and evolution. It's not clear to me that those beliefs are in any sense analogous to one another.
So remember, you're going to have to, for the argument against the defeater thesis to be false, a premise in this argument has to be false. So I'm curious which premise that is. Again, these are the scenarios. So it's basically a false premise would require that, R is defeated in one scenario, but not another.
I think it would only work if the argument is analogous to what we are, only if the XX drug analogy, if that is a good analogy for believing the initial premise of your argument, that you get the first argument that you gave at the beginning. It seems like only if this is a good analogy to that, then would a premise of that argument have to be rejected.
So you're not actually arguing against the logic.
That's not how logic works. The magic of logic is such that the only way this argument can be unsound is with a false premise. It is impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion here. So if this argument is unsound, there needs to be a false premise. So which premise is false?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that this argument, I'm saying the argument could hold and it could still not affect the original, or it could be irrelevant to the evolutionary argument if the XX case is not in any sense analogous to believing that the probability of naturalism and evolution giving you reliable cognitive faculties is low. So there's got to be some kind of there has to be a good analogy. Does that make sense?
Well, no, because do you know what the defeater thesis is?
Yeah, I got that.
Yeah, so the conclusion of the argument is that the defeater thesis is true. Now that's the part you want to reject, right? That the defeater thesis is true.
But this is an analogy,
yes,
and I think what Dave is arguing against is that it's a bad analogy.
Okay, you're going to need a false premise for this argument to be unsound. Just saying there's a bad analogy there somewhere doesn't specify which premise is false.
Well, I think the argument only works if it's a good analogy, right?
I think that's what, if I understand it, David, what you're saying is that this entire argument is an analogy. It's not a direct.
That's the only kind of justification that I've ever seen. Yeah, from people like Maverick and Plantinga, the only defense that they ever seem to give for the defeater thesis is by means of these different kinds of analogies. They give a whole bunch of different ones, and sometimes they're at odds with each other, in my opinion. But either, I'm going to go back to my, that in these sorts of analogies that they're giving, they never specify in what way this is affecting the phenomenology of the subject. So if it's doing it in a local sense, you could determine, in principle, at least if you're not being affected by it adversely, you could determine that you had reliable cognitive faculties and that you were therefore not being affected adversely if it's local. If it's global, you can't do that, of course, but then it seems that it's not in any way analogous to believing that the probability of evolution and naturalism giving you unreliable cognitive faculties is very high.
Okay, remember, the magic of logic is such that if the premises of a valid argument are true, the conclusion is correct, regardless of what else might be true. So a good objection to this argument would be attacking a premise and just saying the first scenario is a bad analogy. Well, even if that's true, that doesn't matter as long as the premises of this argument are true. So which premise is false?
Where does it go from a hypothetical scenario to evolution?
All right, so we go.
It's like in scenario 5. Is that where it actually transitions from some hypothetical? Because that hypothetical scenario sounds like it disproves, it really disproves the reality of perception. That's what it seems to me like. It's like a defeat.
So scenario S5 is where I come to believe in the following. Via a nifty combination of scientific and philosophical argumentation, it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt that naturalistic evolution entails the XX mutation is inevitably part of any humanoid genetics. That's the mutation that injects drug XX into the bloodstream shortly after one is born. And so, but the aforementioned, go ahead.
It seems like I could grant this argument, and all that would follow from this is that if we're taking this to be a global unreliability, then yeah, if you take this drug, then yes, you've got a low probability that your cognitive faculties are reliable. But I'm not seeing that that is going to help the evolutionary argument against naturalism unless it's a good analogy.
So remember, you're going to need a false premise for this argument to be unsound.
The drug does not exist. That's the false premise.
No, well, this argument doesn't claim that the drug exists. There's nothing in this argument that claims the drug actually exists. It's just saying, consider this hypothetical scenario. If it is true that R is defeated in this scenario here, for example, scenario S5. So notice that the premise for line 14 here, if it's defeated in S5, then R is defeated in S6. So S5 is where naturalistic evolution gives everybody the XX mutation, but there's a small chance that we got lucky and that we have the blocking gene. That's scenario S5 here. And that seems pretty darn analogous to the situation of the probability thesis, in which naturalism and evolution has a high probability of giving us unreliable cognitive faculties. Only in this case, really the only relevant difference between S5 and S6 is the mechanism of probable cognitive unreliability. That is, whatever it is that makes the probability thesis true here is different in S5 than it is in S6. But that doesn't seem like it would be a relevant difference.
Does your argument
so go ahead.
Oh, does this argument not establish that this is a possible world, but does not establish that we're living in this world?
Well,
It's logically consistent, but it's not necessarily true in this world.
Yeah, it's not saying that it's true. When I make up a story, just like when you read up a novel, the novel isn't claiming that it's true. This is fiction. This is all a fictional scenario. The idea is, okay, consider this scenario. If R is defeated in this hypothetical scenario, then it would also be defeated in the probability thesis scenario. Since the only relevant difference between S5 and S6 here is the mechanism of probable cognitive unreliability, and that doesn't seem like it would be a relevant difference.
So in return to the argument after this, then it seems to me that we could, I think it is premise 15 that you said, if all of these scenarios here are true, then the defeater thesis is true. Well,
that's not what line 15 says.
Thesis, sorry, I don't see it on your, or if R is defeated, yeah, in S6, then the defeater thesis is true. Then, yeah, if the defeater thesis is being applied to the scenario where people take the XX drug. I'm agreeing with that. I'm saying I don't think that the
that's
XX
not what happens.
drug is.
I mean, in scenario S5, it's that naturalistic evolution entails that everybody gets the XX mutation. And it's that mutation that injects the drug into our system.
So you're making a statement that you're making an assertion there that the senses of biological entities in this world are unreliable.
Something like that. Their cognitive faculties are unreliable. If they have the XX mutation and they don't have the blocking gene, then their cognitive faculties would be unreliable. So the fact that N and E entails the XX mutation would render the probability thesis true, because.
But would not natural selection tend to select against that? Because
no, because remember the
survival.
Well, no, because remember the probability thesis. My justification for that was the naturalistic mental states theorem, which says that given a physical state, no matter which logically possible mental state associations obtained from that physical state, the universe's outcome would be the same. All the causal behavior would be the same. Mental states are effectively epiphenomenal.
No, I took a note about that, but do not living entities react to the environment based on their epiphenomenal mental states, and therefore those mental states do alter the outcomes of physical conditions? And that's how natural selection works, right?
So remember what the probability thesis is actually claiming. Given naturalism and evolution and basically nothing else, how likely is it that we have unreliable cognitive faculties? Now, it might well be that when naturalist selection selects, for example, brain state 1 over brain state 2, and the real world, that supervenience relation is such that that brain state 1 has reliable cognitive faculties. Now, we could grant that that's the way it works in the real world, but that supervenience relationship is not knowable a priori. So we have these electrochemical reactions giving us a brain state. It's like here, for example. So we have these electrochemical reactions giving a brain state. Now, whether it gives us this mental state or this mental state, given the same physical state, it would not affect the behavior of the organisms. So yes, in the real world, that supervenience relation is as beneficial for cognitive faculties being reliable. But conceivably, it didn't have to be that way.
I don't think we're living in that universe, though.
Yeah, that might be, but you can't know that. Think back to the alien scenario.
Okay, aliens, they're in the news, so we're in that universe by the look of it.
Yes, so remember this argument here. So what we know, given just the information in the alien scenario, well, we know that mental states are effectively epiphenomenal, given the way that I said in the way that I described before. No matter which conceivable mental state associations obtained for a given physical state, that physical state's outcome would be the same, including the behavior of the aliens. Now, garbage mental states vastly outnumber those that accurately resemble one's external reality, but we don't have any a priori reason to believe that an alien would have an accurate mental state instead of one of the far more numerous garbage mental states. So we don't know that without any observation whatsoever. Now, in this scenario, all we basically know is naturalism and evolution. Does that give us any information where the aliens have reliable versus unreliable cognitive faculties? Well, not by itself, because it doesn't tell us which supervenience relation obtains.
Well, we don't know whether I think the same problem applies here, because again, we don't know anything about what the phenomenology is of these garbage states. That's not been specified in the analogy.
And this, Well, if we want to return back to the defeater thesis here, okay, if we turn back to the defeater thesis, then we'll have to go back to which premise is false. But I don't see a plausibly false premise here.
Well, again, I think that, I mean, so maybe it will help if I ask this question. Do you think that if someone is making an argument by analogy, and the analogy is not a good one, it doesn't actually, there's nothing about the analogy that's actually analogous to the point of contention, that somebody, if the argument is valid, that they're making based on analogy, that the conclusion is somehow it's a bad analogy?
It depends. Is there a false premise in the argument? In this hypothetical situation you're describing, because you could say
there wouldn't have to be.
That's not how logic works. For a valid argument to be unsound, there needs to be a false premise.
But in your terminology,
it's an argument from analogy again. So
it's a possible world, though. In your initial terms that you gave, you said an argument could be logically valid, but it doesn't make it real in the actual world that we're living in. It just means it's in one of the possible worlds.
So a logically valid argument is where it's logically impossible to have two premises and a false conclusion. So the only way an argument can fail to be sound is with the false premise. Now, you could say that, for example, the analogy is not a good one. Well, which analogy? There's 6 of them. There's 6 different scenarios. And the only scenario, that I'm claiming would actually closely resemble the one with the probability thesis is scenario S6. That's the one I'm claiming is relevantly analogous.
Can we see S6 again? Just for the viewers?
Yeah, that's the one, or S6 is the actual probability thesis, but I suppose the one that's closely resembled to the probability thesis without actually being the probability thesis is scenario S5. Now, you could say that in this scenario S5, R is not defeated there, but it is defeated in the probability thesis scenario, or R is not defeated in the probability thesis scenario, but it is in scenario S5. But really the only relevant difference there is just the mechanism of probable cognitive unreliability. And that, by my lights, does not seem to be a relevant difference between the analogy and the probability thesis scenario.
Okay, and I'm saying I think that is a relevant difference.
So why would the mechanism of probable cognitive unreliability be a relevant difference?
Because we need to know what the phenomenology is that the mechanism is causing, right? If you're going to say like drug XX, if that is supposed to be analogous to evolution giving you an unreliable cognitive faculty, or giving you unreliable cognitive faculties, then we know what it is that we need to know what is here that it's making unreliable. How is this unreliability manifesting itself? Is it in a local or in a global way?
Oh, it's in a global way, as I specified before.
But how can that be true with evolution?
Okay,
because
and then in
evolution...
that case,
well, because as I said, remember the alien scenario. Mental states are effectively epiphenomenal. Given a physical state, it doesn't matter what those mental states are. Now, it could be just by chance that we happen to get lucky, that the relationship between brain states and mental states is such that when a brain state produces advantageous behavior, it happens to give a mental state that accurately resembles one's external reality. But conceivably, that didn't have to be the case, because mental states are effectively epiphenomenal on naturalism.
So you would say that the probability...
Sorry, you go, David.
Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I just want to...
I was going to say...
I got one thing I want to just get clear here, that isn't evolution, this is maybe I don't understand evolution, but isn't evolution the selection of the fittest, most adapted to survive? And isn't that the definition of accurate sense perception, is the one that has the greatest survival fitness?
No,
in evolution?
Because as long as the brain states give advantageous behavior, it doesn't really matter what mental states those produce. So the electrochemical reactions that give advantageous behavior, they could basically put you in an effective dream world, and it really doesn't matter what mental states those electrochemical reactions produce. Now, we optimistically assume that those electrochemical reactions of our brains are giving us, reliable mental states, accurate mental states. But conceivably, it didn't have to be that way. Because again, given a physical state...
Well, so I think there's a deeper point here. We need to establish more than just that it's giving you what you would call garbage mental states. It needs to be giving us garbage mental states that are like the ones that we experience if the argument is going to work. And I don't see any reason to think that evolution, or rather naturalism and evolution, are going to give you brain states like the ones that we have. They're not going to give you the kind that we have, and then have these brain states be completely unlike the external world, and then that's also going to somehow benefit your survival. I do not see a plausible pathway for that.
So is your, well, I'm not sure how that attacks any premise here. Are you going to dispute the line 14 here?
I think that's disputing the fundamental premise of the XX drug existing. I think
remember,
that's right here.
A specific premise needs to be false.
Only if the analogy holds in the first place.
That's not how logic works. The only way for a valid argument to be sound is with a false premise. So by analogy, you got to be more specific when you say the analogy holds. So are you talking about S5?
Logic and analogies are.
I was talking about the whole XX analogy.
Okay, so which one? S5?
Yeah, I mean, you're. Sorry, I can't see the S's right now. I've got the numbers on my screen.
It'll update in a second.
So while he's waiting for the numbers to read. So one of the nice things about having a logically valid argument is it can help kind of obviate red herrings. So it's possible to come up with an objection that, even if true, doesn't really attack any premise of the argument. And as long as the premises are true, the conclusion is correct, regardless of what else might be true. And that's why I constructed it in this logically valid format. So just saying, for example, that, oh, the analogy doesn't work, it's not sufficiently analogous. Well, that's a pretty big objection, because
no, it's S5. XX mutation does not exist. That's the point to attack right there. The XX
no, the S5, there's no premise that says this mutation actually exists. This is just a hypothetical situation saying, in this scenario, NNE entails the XX mutation. Is R defeated in this scenario? That's what the antecedent.
Yeah, okay. So your argument is good for a hypothetical, but not in the real world. That's not the world we live in. It doesn't describe the real world. That's
that's not relevant. You still need a false premise.
Aren't you trying to describe make a statement about the real world with this argument?
That's 16, the defeater thesis. But for this argument to be unsound, there needs to be a false premise. You could say that, well, the XX mutation doesn't exist in the world. Okay, but there's no premise in this argument that claims that. That's a red herring.
Okay, what if we rejected premise 15? Because it seems like you're saying, all right, well, I guess it says if R is defeated, then the thesis is true. All right. So what was it? R is defeated in S1. Let's see. What was S1? Remind me of that one.
That's when I come to believe. I know that Sam ingested drug XX. I initially believed Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable, but then I learned Sam ingested drug XX. It seems that after that point, I have a defeater for my belief that Sam's cognitive faculties are unreliable.
And then, all right, so what's 14 here then? 14 is if R is defeated in S5 is, which one is S5?
S5 is where naturalistic evolution entails the XX mutation, thereby rendering the probability thesis true.
Okay.
No, it renders it possible. It doesn't render it true. It renders it possible.
In this scenario, this probability thesis is true.
But the defeater thesis is possible, it seems like logically possible, but not true.
Well, if that's going to be the case, you're going to need a false premise. So the apparently the most controversial premise right now is line 14. Line 14 says that if R is defeated in S5, then R is defeated in S6.
I'm just trying to follow the structure of it here, because I see that it's strange because it leads from the XX analogy to the EAAN, and so I was just trying to find out which premise it is. Sorry to make you keep switching between the two. I'm just trying to figure out maybe you can help. Which premise is it where you switch over from XX analogy to Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism.
By that, do you mean the defeater thesis? So the defeater thesis is the idea that if the probability thesis is true, if the likelihood of reliable cognitive faculties given naturalism and evolution is low, and I, as a naturalistic evolutionist, see that it is low, then I have the defeater for my cognitive faculties being reliable. That's the defeater thesis. And so that's number 15.
Okay,
I
so
switch from R is defeated. If R is defeated in S6, then the defeater thesis is true.
So yeah, I'm not saying if it follows that just because it's low, therefore it gets defeated. So is that scenario 5?
Well, scenario S6. No. Scenario S6 is where the probability thesis is true. I see that it is true as someone who believes in naturalistic evolution, and therefore, and so, fight 15 here says if R is defeated in S6. So S6 is really just a situation where the probability thesis is true, and I come to believe that it's true. And I believe in naturalistic evolution.
Okay, so what if couldn't we grant that it, if it's defeated, but then say that it has not been defeated in that scenario? Because it seems like in this scenario, you just have that you have the mutation, and that renders it low.
No, S6 doesn't
but
have
that does not necessarily defeat. No, I'm talking about S5 here. So in S5, you've got naturalism and evolution entail that you have the XX mutation, and that renders it low. I agree. I'm not, but how does that defeat R? That's what you would need to establish then.
Okay, so that's what S5 is claiming, that under that situation, R is defeated. So if you don't think that R is defeated in scenario S5, then you want to attack a different premise. So 14 says if R is defeated in S5, then R is defeated in S6. So you could perhaps attack...
So yeah, I think I believe that's the one I would want to challenge.
Which one?
Whichever one that says that R is defeated in S5.
Well, technically neither premise does that. Do you know what a material implication is?
Fortunately not.
Okay. So it's a famous thing in logic. It's basically where, so the only way in a material conditional, like in say line 14, the only way it can be false is if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So the antecedent in 14 is R is defeated in S5, and the consequent in 14 is R is defeated in S6. So the only reason for 14 to be false is that if R is defeated in S5, but R is not defeated in S6. So this argument is basically saying we have a slippery slope here. So which one
I think 13 is probably the one that I think 13 is the one that I'm disagreeing with. I don't think that R
so 13
is necessarily defeated in S5.
But R is defeated in S4? Because that's what 13 being false would
it could
require.
be. I don't actually remember what that. I don't actually remember what was in S4. If you can switch.
Okay, and
back
S4
to that
is
screen.
where.
But
so R S4 is where I have the XX mutation. I come to believe that the drug has. Yeah. I have basically. It's sort of akin to saying that I believe that yes, the XX mutation and the drug was injected into me shortly after I was born.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. So I would think that that is also false. Yeah. So I don't see that reliability is defeated just because you've ingested the XX. Just because you've ingested the drug, it does not of necessity mean that you have had reliability defeated.
Okay, so it sounds like you're objecting to S2. That's where I ingest drug XX.
Well, I don't object to it. You could ingest the drug. Remember, it's only 95% successful. So I'm saying based on whatever the phenomenology is, and this goes back to my phenomenology point, whatever the phenomenology of X is, then you will be able to, depending on whether it's local or global, again, you've said that you've taken it to be global, then in that case, it's simply not analogous to believing in evolution and naturalism, or believing that those entail a low probability of reliable cognitive faculties.
Okay, in that case, I'm lost. So which premise are you objecting to? Which premise do you think is false?
13, I believe, is the one that I'm rejecting here.
Okay, so for 13 to be false, R would have to be defeated in S4, but R is not defeated in S5. And then I would ask, what is the relevant difference between the two where that would take place? Because that doesn't seem to be relevant difference between the two situations.
Sorry, say that again. The difference between what?
So S.
Yeah, I didn't follow
so
that.
you
Sorry.
you attack. Okay, so 13 is R is defeated in S4. For 13 to be false, R would have to be defeated in S4, but R is not defeated in S5. So S4 is I had the XX mutation. S5 is naturalistic evolution gave me the XX mutation. So what is the relative difference?
It doesn't seem to me that either. Well, I
Well,
just don't see
if
either
R is
one
the-
destroys that.
Okay, well then
Sorry,
you
go
wouldn't
ahead.
be objecting to 13. 13 wouldn't be rendered false by R not being defeated in either scenarios. Because for 13, the only way 13 to be
I think
false
it
is
would,
for R
right?
is. No, that's not how material implication works. Material conditional, as I specified in the paper that all these premises were material conditionals. Did you read the paper?
There's a paper?
I did. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I got lost in
Well-
some of the arithmetic, but yes, I read it.
Okay, so as the paper mentions, all these conditionals are material conditionals. So the only way a material conditional can be false is if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So, for example, in the case of 13, the only way 13 can be false is if R is defeated in S4, but R is not defeated in S5. So if R is not
What if
defeated,
it's not defeated in either one?
well, then the material conditional is true. 13 is true.
But it says it is defeated in S5. So if it's not defeated in either one, I'm not seeing how it could be true.
No, it's
Okay,
conditional.
a
so
material,
it's if it is.
Yeah, a material conditional is such that the only way a material conditional is false is if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So R is defeated in S4. That's the antecedent. You with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. And R is defeated in S5. That's called the consequent of the conditional. You with me so far?
Yeah.
All right. Now,
Okay, so
The
couldn't we just agree then that if it is defeated, if you take the X extra, all right, yeah, so then I guess I would agree with that. Yeah, if you agreed that for destroyed reliability or gave you a defeater for it, then yes, I see that you would have to that in scenario 5 as well.
okay, so it seems
I don't
like
think
you
it
might
does
want to.
destroy in scenario 4.
Okay, then it seems like you probably want to object to difference premise. It sounds like you might think that maybe you would object to line 10 here, that if R is defeated in S1, then R is defeated in S2. So in S1, it's Sam ingested drug XX, and in the second scenario, it's where I ingested drug XX.
Yeah, I would not think that cognitive reliability is necessarily destroyed in either of those scenarios.
Oh, you wouldn't, not even in the first one?
Not necessarily. Sam could be in the 5%. I mean,
Well, no,
like-
okay, so
I mean,
okay, in
Okay.
scenario S1, so premise line 9 here is R is defeated in S1. That means I no longer have adequate justification to believe that Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable in that situation. That's what it means to be a defeater. Is that it
I got that.
undercuts the justification. So you believe that
right.
even in this first scenario, I do not have a defeater for thinking that Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable. Is that your position?
You might. I think it would depend on what is the phenomenology of the person who takes X. So yes, you might be able to determine that Sam is having problems if, for example, to go back to my example, if he thinks that he's got like red bumps on him, and that's what the phenomenology is of ingesting XX, and then you haven't taken it, you can determine that he doesn't have those bumps, then yes, you would absolutely have a defeater for believing that his cognitive faculties were reliable in that case. But on the other hand, if he, is seeing things that you can also verify, having not taken the drug, then yeah, you could also verify that he was in the 5%. So it all goes back to what is the phenomenology of XX.
Okay, here, let me remind you of the scenario right here. So I initially believed that Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable, but later I learned that Sam ingested drug XX, and that days later, after the ingestion, Sam came to believe that a doctor has called him, informing me that he has a blocking gene that but I have no independent reason for thinking Sam's belief about the alleged doctor's call is accurate. So maybe just to simplify it here, just suppose we have this information. Drug XX creates global cognitive unreliability in the vast, vast majority of those who take it. Now, suppose I learned that Sam ingested drug XX, and this is like 24 hours ago. Do I have a defeater for my belief that Sam has reliable cognitive faculties, given just the information thus far?
Yes.
Okay. And suppose, and on top of that, I learned that 24 hours later, Sam came to the belief that doctors called him saying that he has reliable cognitive faculties, but this came long after Sam ingested drug XX, and I have no independent reason for thinking that Sam has reliable cognitive faculties or that the doctor call occurred. In this situation, given just this information, do I have a defeater for my belief that Sam's cognitive faculties are reliable?
I would say yes.
Okay, so it seems like you accept that R is defeated in scenario S1 here, because that's all that line 9 says. That R is defeated in S1.
Yeah, so then I guess we would say it's not defeated in 2 would be my position.
Okay, so in this case, as this is a scenario in which I ingest drug XX, and I have no relevant difference that distinguishes my case from Sam's. Now, 24 hours later, after I ingested drug XX, given just this information thus far, do I have a defeater for my cognitive faculties being reliable?
Let me work through that. So the situation here is that you've taken that, and this is global unreliability that we've determined, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you've got global unreliability. No other evidence than that? Yeah, I would guess I would kind of want to know how you came into possession of knowledge that you ingested that drug. So kind of that's where my mind wants to go there. But if somehow you could be justified in holding that you had ingested the drug, I don't know how global it can be, though, because if you've got justification for whole belief, then there's got to be some degree of reliability.
Well, maybe you don't have justification. Let's just suppose I remember taking the drug. I remember that I ingested drug XX, and that's a belief I had. And it seems that, remember the definition of a defeater in the paper.
Wouldn't that be?
So given the definition of a defeater in this paper is that given that I hold a certain belief D, as long as I hold this belief, I can no longer be rationally justified in believing another belief B. So as long as in this being a defeater here would be, as long as I believe that I ingested drug XX, say 24 hours ago, I no longer have adequate grounds to believe that my cognitive faculties are reliable. I'm no longer justified in believing that. That would be what it means for R to be defeated in scenario S2 here, basically.
Yeah, I got that.
I mean, it raises the inevitable question.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, again, if we're saying that it's the... Go ahead, Josh.
Sorry, I was just going to say it raises the inevitable question. Do you have any XX to share? Also, the other question would be,
Everyone's
even if you
breaking
haven't taken... Yeah, I think, David, your connection might be a bit slow. Maverick, are you experiencing like a large amount of latency?
Not a whole lot. I mean, David was breaking up occasionally, but I don't seem to get anything from you.
Okay,
I mean, and no breakups from you.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, I think, David, your connection's a little bit laggy. It would seem also in this point, first of all, I'm really appreciating the way that the two of you are working through this. Arjuna said pretty technical stuff, and like this is probably one of the most technical discussions that we've had on the channel. And so I'm really appreciating the two of you working through this like this. At this point here in scenario S2, it seems to me that even if you actually have no way of knowing whether you've ingested the drug or not, because you have global cognitive unreliability from taking the drug. So even if you think that you never took it, you're like, how would I actually know? Because if I did take it, I wouldn't be able to rely on my senses. Would that be S0?
Yeah, that's kind of that one objection's been made was like, well, if all your cognitive faculties have been undermined in general, then wouldn't your belief that you ingested drug XX be undermined? And in a way, yeah. But I mean, in a way, it's also like, can you really ingest drug XX and be mistaken about it? Is kind of another question, because, well, how would global cognitive unreliability work? I mean, because remember, the definition of a defeater is that all it says is that you can't believe that you have, in this case, you can't be rationally justified in believing that you have reliable cognitive faculties while holding on to this belief that you've taken cognitive reliability destroying drug. Here's another way to look at it. Suppose I come to believe that I've taken drug XXX. Now, XXX has a 100% chance of rendering cognitive faculties unreliable. Can I believe that my cognitive faculties are reliable? Can I be rational believing that while also believing that I have taken this drug? Well, clearly not. Even if there is it kind of undermines my belief that I've taken drug XX, it's still the case that I can't be rationally justified in believing that I have reliable cognitive faculties, given that I also believe that I have taken drug XXX.
It's the blue pill in the matrix, yo.
And so similarly, drug XX doesn't have like a 100% chance, obviously, but the same sort of principle applies in that I still can't rationally be justified in believing that I have reliable cognitive faculties as long as I have believed that I've taken this drug that has a very high probability of destroying my cognitive faculties.
Since that argument is logically consistent, is that not a defeater for reality?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's a big difference. So there's a big difference between bare possibility that we could be living in a dream world and accepting belief that says you probably actually are living in a dream world. Big difference between bare possibility and actual probability. So if I were a naturalist or like a naturalistic evolutionist, I would be kind of like, yeah, I'm probably living in a dream world right now, but I'm just going to behave as if I'm not, because what else is there to do? That's what I would believe if I were a naturalist, because I don't see any way to get around this. I mean, it seems that naturalistic evolution really is like something akin to drug XX. Now you could say that it isn't. Then I've created this sort of like argument here where I go from A to B to C to B to D, and if all the dots connect, well then the defeater thesis is true.
Yeah, in that case, I think because you're drawing a distinction between probability and possibility here and saying that that makes it not a defeater, because it would seem to me that following the structure of your argument here, like if I see the barn and it could be a facade or a real barn and I don't know, in the same way, since there could be some XXX drug or phenomenon that would make my cognitive senses globally unreliable, that would be a defeater in the sense that I can no longer reasonably hold the belief that reality is real as I perceive it.
I suppose you could believe that if you want to. Some skeptics have argued that way, but I don't think, in my opinion anyway, bare possibility is enough. In this case, how the defeater thesis work is that there's an actual probability. I'm actually accept a belief that says it probably is the case that my global cognitive faculties are reliable. So if nothing else, the case for defeat here, if the probability thesis is true and you accept naturalism and evolution, is way stronger, because at that point it's no longer possibility, it's actual probability.
How's your connection now, David? Welcome back.
I don't know. It just threw me out. So yeah, I'm back. It might be my honest. I've been on today. Tired, but if I'm coming through all right, then we should be able to just continue.
Rock on.
So I forgot a little bit where we were.
So it seemed like you agreed that R was defeated.
I think we were
in S1, and that R is defeated in S2.
Yeah. So let's keep working through that. So then it's like it would be in 3 as well. It doesn't seem like the point of you getting it at the point at which you get the drug is going to matter. How about let's work through scenario for a little bit.
That's where I believe I have the XX mutation, and this is the mutation that basically gives me drug XX as an infant.
All right, and so this isn't the mutant blocks?
So so there's drug XX and then there's a blocking gene, but it's not that many people have the blocking gene in this scenario. So given that I have the given, for example, that a person has the XX mutation and no further relevant information, it's very likely that their cognitive faculties are unreliable. So in scenario S4, I have the XX mutation, which injects drug XX into my body as an infant. That's S4.
Okay, and so yeah, that would seem to follow just as well as in 5, or in 3 rather. So scenario 5, let's see. Naturalism and evolution entail mutation, rendering it right. So maybe we work through that. Why is it that if, because going back to this presented after this, you say that if naturalism and evolution entail the mutation, then it therefore follows that PNR on natural evolution is low.
So in this scenario, it's proven through a nifty combination of scientific and philosophical argumentation that it unavoidably entails that the XX mutation arises. So obviously this isn't real life. In real life, this argumentation doesn't exist. But in this fictional scenario, that's what we've determined, that given naturalistic evolution, it entails unavoidably the XX mutation.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just not following. You could maybe this part, but it seems like we're going that in this hypothetical scenario that entails.
Yeah, it entails the XX mutation. Here's another way to look at it. The probability.
Sorry, something.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so here's another way to look at it. It's been demonstrated that given naturalism and evolution, the probability that we have the XX mutation is 100% in this fictional scenario. That's another way to look at it. And because XX mutation, has a high probability, kind of by definition, of rendering cognitive faculties unreliable, I mean, that's what makes the probability thesis true in this fictional scenario.
Yeah, I got that. So what are we going from this fiction to that it's low to all right, then let's go here then, because it seems like we're saying that from having you've got a low global liabilities, that is somehow analogous to have global unreliability, naturalistic in a scenario. What you would say is the probability is high that you would have global unreliability?
Given naturalistic evolution, yes. That's the probability thesis. So my version of probability thesis anyway.
All right, so maybe then I don't want to cut back on, where I wanted to take this was to the defeater thesis, but maybe this is going to go back there then. Maybe you can explain why you think it is that you would get global here, because I could see a local unreliability, and at least as I've read Plantinga, those are normally what his arguments are for, is for local unreliability. So I'm not
no, it's
I'm not used to someone taking the position.
That's what he's written in his papers.
Plantinga's examples seem to be locally.
No, drug XX was global cognitive unreliability. I even cited a source in my paper that kind of explained the type of unreliability Plantinga has in mind here. I think I gave the quote on page 2 in section 1.1.
Oh, looks like David's dropped out again. This here is where you go from your fictional scenario to make a statement about the probability in the real world, though. Am I correct?
Sort of. So the argument for the defeater thesis doesn't actually say that the probability thesis is true. What its position is that if the probability thesis is true, and the naturalistic evolutionist believes that it's true, well, then that naturalistic evolution has a defeater for their cognitive faculties being unreliable.
So the probabilistic thesis again is...
let's see here. Yeah, here's the argument in a nutshell. The probability thesis is the part of the argument that says, given naturalistic evolution, we probably have unreliable cognitive faculties. That's the probability thesis.
Okay, I disagree with that then.
All right. Well, then we can... Is Dave there?
He's not. He's offline at the moment. He got knocked off.
Right,
I think that's the weak point there.
All right. Well, then we'll have to take into account the argument for that. So this is the argument for it. I claim that if the probability thesis applies to the alien scenario, it also applies to the real scenario. So presumably you wouldn't think that applies to the alien scenario because, I mean, really the only difference is, aliens and humans. And in both cases, we're basically considering the probability of cognitive unreliability given just naturalistic evolution. But then here we have this deductive argument here. Now, the main problem with naturalism right here is that mental states are effectively epiphenomenal. That is, no matter which conceivable mental state association obtains for a given physical state, that physical state's outcome will be the same. So even if it is true that natural selection, for example, selects for brain states that produce advantageous behavior, what it does not select for is which mental states those electrochemical reactions produce. And in fact, no matter which conceivable mental state association obtained for a given physical state, that physical state's outcome would be the same.
But what you're calling a garbage mental state.
That's basically like having a dreamlike mental state.
But since the mental state has no impact on the physical world, all mental states are garbage mental states.
Well, potentially. I mean, there is a very, very... Think of like when you're dreaming. When you're dreaming, there is definitely a very small chance that you're dreaming of lying in bed, in which case it would happen to accurately reflect the external world. But it's not very likely.
That though presupposes that your mental state when you're lying in bed and experiencing lying in bed is not a garbage mental state, but you have no way of knowing that. Since mental states have no bearing on the physical world, there is absolutely no connection between what you think that you perceive in your mental state and what's really going on at all.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it could be that the electrochemical reactions that produce advantageous behavior also produce a mental state that accurately reflects the world, but it seems very unlikely because mental states are effectively epiphenomenal in naturalism.
Okay, so that's a fundamental tenet of naturalism, that mental states are epiphenomenal.
Well, not quite. I said effectively epiphenomenal. That basically means it's sort of a de facto epiphenomenal. It's as if mental states are epiphenomenal. And so naturalism per se doesn't say that epiphenomenalism is true. However, it's unavoidable given naturalism that mental states are in effect epiphenomenal. And the reason, let's go back here. So I kind of gave a thought experiment that kind of explained the general reasoning behind it. Imagine we have a physical state where the electrochemical reactions of our brain result in some mental state, like in this picture here, like a woman jumping through the air. Now imagine we have the same physical state that has the same physical conditions and the same physical laws, but those electrochemical reactions generated a completely different mental state. Would that brain's behavior be any different? Well, it wouldn't, because we have the same physical conditions and same physical laws, and there's nothing supernatural to change how things would go.
Well, hang on a second. You're now positing that the mental state is supernatural because you cannot have the same physical state in the brain and a different mental state unless the mental state is something that's not the physical state of the brain.
No, that's not quite true. So this is why I went through all that terminology before about conceivability and metaphysical possibility. Mm-hmm. So remember that water is H2O. That's not an a priori truth. We needed empirical investigation to know whether this wet stuff was identical to H2O. Now, in the paper, I discuss identity theory, the idea that mental states are identical to brain states. Mm-hmm. But even in that situation, how do we know which mental state a brain state is identical to? Well, it's the same problem. We can only know through empirical investigation.
Now, what is a mental state if it's not a brain state?
So I define that here. It's not by definition a brain state anyway. Mental state is the inner aspects of one's mind as pro tanto it pertains to sense experiences, thoughts, feelings, etc. Such that a mental state is a collection of such pro tanto internal mental phenomena that one's neurophysiology, brain state produces, at least if naturalism and contemporary science are correct
what
about
is pro tanto?
To that extent.
One's internal aspects of one's mind, but what is the mind if it's not the brain state?
That's less unspecified by the theorems.
Qualia, kind of like some metaphysical thing. Has to be metaphysical if it's not the brain state, right?
Well, maybe. You could believe, if I were a naturalist, I would believe that consciousness is an emergent property. That it's just something that happens when electrochemical reactions happen in a certain way.
How can you be a naturalist and posit a physical state and then a different mental state that is not the physical state? I mean, that's supernaturalism right there.
No. That's not how it works. Think of water being identical to H2O. We know that water is identical to H2O, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's a definition.
Well, no, not by definition. We needed empirical research to discover that. Because we knew of water long before that we knew that water is identical to H2O.
So you're saying water and the combination of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen atom?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we knew that that there was this wet stuff out there prior to us discovering that water is identical to H2O. Now, what that means is that it is logically possible for water not to be identical to H2O. There's no self-contradiction in that. It's conceivable, that is, we can't rule it out a priori that water is not identical to H2O. We needed empirical research for that. That same principle applies here. Now, even if it might be like, say, metaphysically impossible for the electrochemical reactions in a brain to produce, this rather than this, it's still logically possible. We couldn't rule it out a priori. The only way we could rule out that electrochemical reactions produce this instead of this is through empirical investigation. There's no other way for us to know about it. So here's the thought experiment. Given that these two are logically possible, we can run this thought experiment. Suppose we had the same physical state as before, but those electrochemical reactions resulted in a different mental state. Would the outcome be any different under this hypothetical scenario? And the answer is no, because we have the same physical laws, the same physical conditions.
Yeah, I don't know if you can say that that's logically possible, though, unless you're willing to say that there's some as yet unidentified thing that could differ between them. But you could say that about anything in that case.
No, think about what logical possibility is. Remember water being identical to H2O. Is it logically impossible for water to be identical to not be identical to H2O?
Well, this is different to that for the following reason. We know that hydrogen and oxygen atoms exist, and we know that water exists. Here, you're saying that we know that physical states of the brain exist, and we say that that's a mental state. If you're going to say a mental state is something other than a physical state of the brain, you're positing the existence of something that you could posit the existence of anything. Just say, well, it's some as yet undiscovered supernatural thing, or some natural thing that we haven't discovered. Like, what is the mental state if it is not the physical state of the brain?
Okay, that's not how this works at all.
No?
Think of, suppose we grant that a brain state is identical to a mental state. All right, suppose we grant that. Suppose we grant identity theory naturalism is true. Now, it is logically possible for a brain state to be identical to a different mental state. Now, why do I say that? Well, because we conceive, it's conceivable. Remember, conceivable just means it can't be ruled out a priori for us to discover that the electrochemical reactions produce a different mental state. Because how do we know which mental states are identical to the brain state? Through empirical observation. That is the only way for us to know about it. Just like with water. How do we know that water, this wet stuff, is identical to H2O? Empirical investigation. That's the only way for us to know about it. And if that is the case, then there really is nothing self-contradictory for having a different observation. So whether this is true or this is true, there's no logical contradiction here, because it is conceivable that you can't rule it out a priori that a given brain state results in this mental state as opposed to this mental state. Even granting that identity theory is true, you can't rule it out a priori.
I think you can, for the following reason, because we may not know that H2O combined together forms water, but we do know that water is formed of some particles. We may not know which physical state of the brain corresponds to that dream or to the other dream, but we know that one does. And we would logically say that it is a one-to-one correspondence, just like we logically could rule out that water is H2O or H2O2. Like those,
well, think about it.
Logically say they're two different things.
Okay, how is it that we know that a brain state is associated with this mental state rather than this mental state? How is it that we know? Do we know it through empirical investigation?
No, we know it because there is nothing other than the physical brain state. So that is what a mental state is. There's a one-to-one correspondence between them.
But how do we know that a brain state is identical to this mental state rather than this mental state? How it is that we know that? Through empirical observation.
Yes. But
yes.
What you're saying here is this: you're saying the same physical state, but it has a different mental state. But
I'm saying that's logically possible. That's it. That it's conceivable.
No, I don't think it is. It's like saying it's conceivable that water could be associated to different chemical compositions.
Yeah, it is conceivable. Okay, so yeah, okay. Remember what the word conceivable means. Conceivable means you can't rule it out a priori. So, for example, water being not being identical to H2O. Can we rule that out a priori? We cannot, because that required empirical investigation for us to know that water is identical to H2O.
But are we not making the statement here that the same physical state, water, but a different mental state, H2O? So are we not making the statement here that you could have water and it could be associated to multiple different instantiations of chemical compounds? Isn't that not the statement being made here?
So here's an analogy that might help. There's a famous a story in philosophy called Twin Earth. Now, Twin Earth is exactly like our actual Earth, except that the stuff that they call water there, it looks like water, it tastes like water, but it's not water. It's some complex chemical compound that's abbreviated as XYZ.
Okay.
Now, it is conceivable, like say, prior to the chemical composition of water, that we could have discovered that water is XYZ instead of H2O. How do we know that water is identical to H2O? It's through empirical observation. And if that's true, then it is conceivable, that is, you can't rule it out a priori, that water is not identical to H2O. That's all that conceivable means here. And so how would you rule out something a priori? Well, if there's like a self-contradiction involved, like there's a married bachelor or something like that. But there's no contradiction in water not being identical to H2O because you needed empirical investigation to uncover that. Now it's the same here. How do we know that certain electrochemical reactions are associated with this mental state rather than that mental state? The only way we know that's the case, which mental states are associated with which brain states, is through empirical observation. So what I'm saying here is that it's conceivable. That is, you can't rule it out a priori which brain state is going to be associated with which mental state. Now, it might be that through some metaphysical necessity, a brain state has to be associated with some mental state by some sort of metaphysical rule out there. But that's not what this is claiming. All this is claiming is that, okay, even if it is metaphysically necessary that it has to be this way rather than that way, it's conceivable. It's conceivable to have a different mental state. And that's an extremely low bar to me.
Let me see if I got this then. So this is kind of like the qualia kind of question where people are like, is what you experience as read the same thing as what someone else experiences as read? And there's like no way to know that. And so you're saying that the physical thing that's experienced as being read is the physical state. And then there's a mental state of like, this thing is read, but it might be a misperception. So what this part of the argument is claiming is that given a physical state, same physical conditions, physical laws, now it is logically possible, it's conceivable for there to be a mental associated, those electrochemical reactions resulting in a different mental state. And that seems to be true because imagine if our empirical research, uncovered that instead, would we not believe it? Well, of course we would, because that's what our empirical research would tell us. So the only way we know which mental state is associated with which brain state is through empirical observation. And if that's true, then you can't rule it out a priori which mental state is going to be associated with which brain state, in which case it is conceivable for a given brain state to result in a different mental state. Now, it might be impossible for some metaphysical reason,
but it's still conceivable.
Okay, so you're saying that for any physical state of the brain X, there is a mental state Y, and it could be anything. But there's a one-to-one correspondence between X and Y?
So even if it is true that, say, a given physical state by metaphysical necessity, if we kind of go back to the argument here, so mental states are effectively epiphenomenal. That is, no matter which conceivable set of mental state associations obtained for a given mental state, that physical state's outcome will be the same. Now, with respect to conceivable mental states, garbage mental states vastly outnumber those that accurately resemble one's external reality. Now, again, these are just conceivable mental states. Now, because in the alien scenario, our information is so limited, we don't know what those correspondence rules are. We don't know that supervenience relations. You might say, okay, electrochemical reactions of an alien's brain produces a mental state, but because our information is so limited, we don't know what that mental state is. And there are countless conceivable mental state associations that could be there.
Yeah, like why do they make prop circles? Who knows?
And so that's kind of what this alien scenario is about, is because given our extremely limited information in the alien scenario, and because mental states are effectively epiphenomenal in the way that I described, it seems that the epistemic probability is very high that these aliens have unreliable cognitive faculties, largely because mental states are effectively epiphenomenal, and there's so many conceivable mental states, most of them are going to be garbage.
So epiphenomenal means that they are like a narrative about what actually happens rather than causative?
Well, epiphenomenal simpliciter means that mental brain states produce mental states, but mental states don't cause anything. Now, effectively epiphenomenal is basically kind of my fancy way of saying as sort of as if epiphenomenalism is true. It might not be technically true, but it has that kind of same effect. Because even if you assume, for example, that brain states are identical to mental states, you don't know a priori which mental state is going to be identical to that brain state. And you basically get the same sort of problem. Because even if you assume that mental states strongly supervene on brain states, there are countless strong supervenience relations, and most of them are going to be garbage.
When you say garbage, what do you mean by that?
Basically like a dream-like mental state.
Well, I mean, like, you have all these people, some of them vote for Trump, some vote for Biden, some think that voting's a waste of time, and people are acting based on those different things. So it seems as though differing mental states, we might call them, perceptions about the world, do actually lead people to act in different ways.
Okay, in the real world, we can believe that the relationship between brain state and mental states are those where brain states that are selected by natural selection also happen to result in accurate mental states. You can believe that that's the way it works in the real world. But in this fictional scenario, the alien scenario, we don't know that's the case. Our information doesn't warrant us assuming that, because there are a lot of conceivable mental states, and most of those are going to be garbage.
But if we're accepting evolution as being true, wouldn't that say that, you know, the garbage ones get selected out, like the truly garbage ones?
Well, no. Think about what the problem is for mental states being epiphenomenal. Suppose it is true that natural selection selects brain state B1 over B2. Now, which mental state is associated with B1? Well, natural selection by itself doesn't really say. It doesn't really tell us that information. It doesn't tell us the supervenience relations. It just selects the brain state that produces adaptive behavior. So that is why when I say in 35.4, due largely to 35.1 and 35.2, entity being true for the aliens is not an a posteriori reason to believe an alien would have an accurate mental state instead of one of the more numerous garbage mental states. Why is that the case? Well, because given a physical state, no matter which mental state association obtains, the same outcome would occur. So even if natural selection favors B1 or B2, it does not matter as far as natural selection cares what mental state is associated with it. Those electrochemical reactions could be producing like a dream world, and it wouldn't matter as long as that brain state causes adaptive behavior.
Welcome back, David. Reconnected, I see.
I'm so sorry about that, guys. Yeah, my computer completely froze up. I rebooted it. I think that was the problem instead of my Wi-Fi. Uh-oh, looks like it's starting to freeze up again. Oh, yeah, I am sorry about that. What I wanted to say is that, so this is one thing me about this conversation, Maverick, is that I don't think I'm actually well prepared for it. Because my understanding of the evolutionary argument against naturalism is that it was dependent on some kind of externalist theory of epistemic justification, of some kind of reliabilism. And kind of as, you know, when you sent me your pitch, I read through it, it did look to me like your version of the argument very much did not. And so, you know, I had about a half to kind of study your version of the argument. So I, you know, brought together kind of the objections that I did. The argument you're presenting actually held pretty good against the kind of objections that I have been that I raised. So yeah, I mean, I'll say that I would definitely concede that I think that your version it's interesting, and it gives me as a a Christian a new possible argument to pursue on this. So I will be taking your version of this argument more seriously in my own study, because it does seem that it does not depend on a theory of epistemic justification that I reject.
Is that accurate? Does this version of the argument not rely on epistemic justification?
Well, it doesn't rely on externalism,
well, not
the defeater thesis.
Right, and I was under the impression that it did, which is where most of my opposition to the argument came in. And so I actually not finding as many reasons to be skeptical of Maverick's version. Not saying I'm convinced of it yet, but it doesn't fall prey to basically the kind of objections that I had, that I traditionally thought that the argument did fall prey to.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm convinced yet, and I'm clear that I don't fully understand it yet too.
So the part with mental states being effectively epiphenomenal, where given a physical state, no matter which conceivable mental state associations obtained for that physical state, the same outcome would result. That's the part that kind of convinced me. Plantinga did something sort of similar to that, and that's what kind of convinced me that the evolutionary argument from naturalism was a good argument, because prior to that, I didn't see it. So again, for example, what the theorems say is that given a physical state of evolving organisms, whether that physical state resulted in had garbage mental states or accurate mental states would not affect the behavior of those organisms. The outcome would be the same. That's why natural selection is effectively useless at addressing that sort of problem.
I've just finished, I'm just about to finish listening to Donald Hoffman's The Case Against Reality. I don't know if you're familiar with that book at all, or Donald Hoffman's work. He's
was that the guy who argued that basically if evolution is true, our mental states are basically a user interface and they're not actually reflecting reality, literally?
Yeah.
I have heard of that. And I was thinking that, yeah, it's pretty similar. It's in some ways it's similar to mine. And yeah, if I were a naturalist, I'd probably believe something like that.
He arrives at like consciousness as the fundamental force. And he did it through, he was doing experiments in evolutionary game theory and the evolution of vision. And he said at some point in the computer modeling and everything, they had to make a choice about whether they were going to say that physical elements were the fundamental unit or whether consciousness was the fundamental unit. And they just flipped a coin and went with consciousness. And he said at the end of it all, he basically proved that consciousness is the fundamental driving principle of the universe from evolution and from evolutionary game theory. And a lot of what he talks about, perception and mental states, is in the same kind of domain as this discussion.
He's the guy who defends, he's kind of like Descartes' modern defender of the cogito, right?
I think it's pretty much,
cogito. Yeah. But it almost sounds like Kantian constructivism, actually. You know, the pneuma and the... Like we can only... You familiar with Kantian constructivism, like the pneuma and the phenomenon? All right, so the pneuma is basically what we can tell, if I remember correctly. Pneuma is what we can perceive, and then or phenomena is what we could see, but we don't know what the external world is. We can only see what's in front of our eyes right here. So yeah, noumena is the reality of the external world, and the phenomena is basically with the way reality appears to us.
Okay. Objective and subjective, objective reality and subjective perception.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what David was asking before about the phenomenology of the cognitive unreliability, whether it's local or global. So that's like the way that things appear to us, the phenomenology of the world.
I think that David was getting that. I believe that's a question for David.
Well, I think that is relevant to how accurate one thinks or rather how one do this kind of remind, what was the question again? How were you phrasing it?
So Maverick just brought up phenomena and noumena.
Right. And how did that relate to global versus local skepticism?
We were talking about Hoffman's idea of evolution. The idea that Hoffmann thought the idea that basically what we see is like we're using, his analogy was like, imagine we're using the user interface to navigate the world, but the underlying reality is completely different from what we actually see. Like we might move one file here over to another folder, but there really is no file or folder. The underlying reality is completely different. It just appears that way to us for our own convenience. And so that's when I brought the distinction between the noumena and the phenomena.
Yes. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if there was a question in there, but okay.
I think, Josh, you had a question about what David meant by phenomenology of the person.
Yeah, you at the beginning were talking about phenomenology, David, and you specifically used it when you talked about the phenomenology of the cognitive unreliability.
Yeah, I think in any sort of these skeptical sort of scenarios, or any scenario that is used in support of the self-defeat thesis, it's I think it's always important to get what the phenomenology of the unreliability is. Is it going to be local or global? Because that is going to be relevant to how at least the particular person whose work I was drawing on, how he would go about dealing with the evolutionary argument against naturalism, because he would bring a very different sort of argument against it if the unreliability was presumed to be local than he would if it was presumed to be global.
We got some questions from the viewers here. You guys okay to take some questions now?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so Nick Barak is asking. So he's got a bunch of questions in here. Let's have a look. Okay, so this one's about the phenomenon and the noumena. Noumena. If we accept the existence of noumena, I guess this is like, couldn't it be superior than the phenomena? I'd like to hear your opinions. Users' opinions.
I'm not sure if I completely understand that question. I guess I don't know what he means by superior.
I guess this goes back to this. This was a point that Maverick and I were discussing while you were offline, David, about the physical and mental states, or like perception and reality. What's the meaning of a garbage mental state? What does cognitive unreliability actually mean? I guess this maybe crosses over into metaphysics, because like what noumena would be some kind of metaphysical objective reality. Is that what that is? I don't know.
So in Kant's metaphysics, noumena is the thing in itself, the stuff that's real, and phenomena is basically the thing, how it appears to us. So there's the kind of like objective reality, and then there's how things appear to us. And Kant was saying we basically can't know what noumena is. We can only know what our phenomena is, what actually things appear to us. If I remember correctly, I never actually took a course on Kant.
Okay.
That's what I remember from one of my philosophy classes.
So it sounds like Hoffman's file interface kind of thing. The phenomenon is the things you click on your screen with your mouse, and then the noumena is like whatever's going on in the background, the ones and zeros streaming through a CPU somewhere.
Yeah, so you can apply Kantian terminology to Hoffman's idea, assuming I'm correctly remembering Hoffman.
Man, I'm reading too many books at the same time. I'm reading Beyond Biocentrism by Robert Lanza. I'm pretty sure this is where this one comes from. He says, like, there is no time, space, colors, or anything. That's all created inside the brain. What's actually out there, the noumena, is just electromagnetic fields. And then even time and space themselves are created as user interface representations of those fields. And that's like specific to, the senses and the brain of the evolved living entities. Let's have a look. Here we go. Here's a question from WFA. What's the difference between Plantinga's view and presuppositionalism?
All right, so
maybe
I'm not
before the difference, you could explain what each of those are, because like ELI 5, please.
All right, let's see if I remember this correctly. The idea behind presuppositionalism is that Christianity, or perhaps even weaker theism in general, you kind of need that, because otherwise, without that, it undermines basically all of our beliefs. And so you need to presuppose something like theism to kind of have rationality in general. Am I remembering that correctly, David? That's what my memory tells me.
Yeah. So and I don't know if you want me to go into my answer to that question there, but yeah, basically presuppositionalism, there's a few different types of it. So you've got like the Clarkian school, the Van Tillian school, the Schaefferian school. Most of the time, like what people mean presuppositionalism is they're talking about Van Tillian presuppositionalism, and Van Tillian presuppositionalism says, yes, in order to account for so-called preconditions of intelligibility, things like regularity in nature or laws of logic, what have you, you must presuppose the Christian worldview in its entirety, usually the Calvinist version thereof. And if you don't presuppose that that is true, then you have no justification for any of your other beliefs.
So yeah, Plantinga's argument here, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, is nothing like that at all.
When you say Calvin's view, is that like an Einsteinian block universe with full determinism in it? Is that what?
No, it's a theological thing.
But isn't like Calvinism that there's no free will?
It does. So they would affirm free will, but they are not. They don't affirm libertarian free will. At least, not usually. There are some who do, but in general, there'd be compatibilists with respect to free will. So yeah, it'd be inaccurate to say that Calvinists don't believe in free will. They just don't believe in free will as normally defined. My position is that the evolutionary argument against naturalism is sort of like a version of presuppositionalism, that I think there is overlap between the two, but it's distinct in that it's not focusing on things like regularity in nature. It's not focusing on things like laws of logic, but it is effectively saying that you've got, an incoherent worldview that, if you adopt theism, not full Christianity, but if you adopt theism, you don't have that problem. So there is similarity there. I might call it a sort of like a more softer sort of presuppositionalism, or maybe they wouldn't like that term at all.
Oh, but we should be very careful here. The evolutionary argument against naturalism does not by itself say that theism escapes a problem. Now, a theist would probably agree that theism solves a problem, but the conclusion of the argument doesn't say that.
Right. Well, they're saying Plantinga's view. Plantinga himself does say that he thinks that theism doesn't run into this problem. So I think there is, and I mean, Plantinga himself comes out of a kind of strongly reformed point of view. So I think I see similarities between the two. But if we're going with presuppositionalism as Van Tillian presuppositionalism, then no, they're not the same.
And then Slam RN says, hey, Maverick. And also, I think they're only asking because Plantinga is a Calvinist.
Is he?
But not a very good one. He is, but he says by his own admission, he says he's not a very good Calvinist.
Because I thought, and I'm not a theologian, but I thought Calvinism was a determinism, that the only free will they could have was, at least for human beings, would be a soft deterministic view.
That is most of them. That's the majority view, but they actually, like Oliver Crisp wrote a book called Deviant Calvinism, and he's got a chapter in there arguing actually that Calvinists can believe in libertarian free will. My friend J.D. Martin runs a Calvinist YouTube channel. He also affirms libertarian free will. So there are a few Calvinists out there who do affirm libertarian free will, including Plantinga, but it's definitely the minority view.
Is that the same Oliver Twist who's in the Christmas Carol movie?
I would imagine not. Oliver
Twist is
Oliver
a
Twist.
completely different Charles Dickens novel.
Oh, okay.
I think you're thinking of Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim is the little crippled orphan.
That's the one. Yes. Okay, I didn't know he was a Calvinist. WFA says that's exactly what they were looking for.
Glad to help.
Yeah, let's have a look what else we got in here. We got a couple of minutes left. We'll answer these questions that are burning on people's minds. How about this one? Is not theism touching on the noumena?
Well, a theist would believe that God exists as part of the objective world. So, I mean, in that sense, yes. I'm honestly not sure I'm correctly understanding the question.
Yeah, I was guess it's a little vague to me what it meant by touching on. But yeah, I would basically go with
It's that
Maverick.
isn't it that Michelangelo? It's that Michelangelo fresco, you know, with the fingers. I guess the claim was that the noumena cannot be known, right?
Well, Kant would say that.
But yeah, a person's not committed to saying that. You could hold to a distinction between the two without saying that the noumena could not be known.
Okay, we got a request here. This is from Arjuna. He's asking me to summarize both sides to make it a real explain it like I'm 5. It's going to be an explain it like I'm 3 if I do this. Let me see if I can get this. Okay, let me see if I can summarize this defeater argument against it is the evolutionary argument against naturalism, right? This is the defeater. So it's an evolutionary argument that defeats naturalism. And the argument is that since it is possible that our senses may give us a completely unreliable picture of reality, and we do not know whether that is the case. Have I got it wrong already?
Yeah. The probability thesis says that the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given naturalism and evolution is low. So it's not just possible, it's the probability part is important here.
Okay. So
okay.
So we're probably in the matrix. Yeah. So we're probably in the matrix, which means that naturalism is false.
No. So I'll see if I can give it a shot here.
Okay.
So there are 2 key claims here. One is the probability thesis that says the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given naturalism and evolution is low. The defeater thesis says that the naturalistic evolutionist who believes that the probability thesis is true, that is, they believe that given naturalistic evolution, their cognitive faculties are probably unreliable. The naturalist who sees that and believes it has a defeater for their cognitive faculties being reliable. That is, they're not at that point, as long as they believe the probability thesis is true, they're no longer in a rational position to believe that their cognitive faculties are reliable. They're not justified in believing it at that point while they're believing the probability thesis.
I love it. It's like atheism for scientists, right? It's like it argues you out of your faith in empiricism, because science is based on empirical perception and, logical inference. And then it's like, okay, I'm a disprove both of those things using an argument, from science itself.
Yeah, because what's the naturalist going to do? Be a creationist?
Yeah, it's kind of like, you got nowhere to go. I love it. Okay, so David, let me see if I can get the explain it like I'm 2 for this one. Your argument against it started with asking for the phenomenology of the of the sense unreliability, and somehow that was important or relevant to whether or not this argument worked. And
well, I think his objection was that the analogies fail in some way. That was his initial objection, anyway.
Well, or that
the
analogies need to be clarified, and that when they are clarified, then either it's going to be in such a way that you could easily determine, given that you were part of the group that had reliable faculties, you could easily make that determination, or else it would fail to be analogous to the situation we're actually facing.
I don't know, for me, I'm like, sometimes I moderate shows or debate people, and I'm like, there's absolutely no way we can actually know anything for certain, because we know it through our senses, but we have no way of verifying whether our senses are actually accurate or not. Like, we literally could be in the Matrix, and then people are like, oh, that's just, you're just being silly or something like that. I'm like, but like, I can't get past that place. And it seems like that's where your argument starts from, Maverick, that it begins from saying that not only is that like possible, but it's actually probable. And I'm just
given
like,
naturalism and evolution, yeah,
I'll take it. But why are other people not convinced by that then? Like, why don't I jump on these shows and I go, we can't know anything, and they're like, I know, right? Like, why is this not like the major belief amongst scientists and atheists?
So this is a draft of a paper. It hasn't actually been officially published yet. Part of the reason why I want to do this debate and kind of talk with people is see if I can get other people inputs to see if maybe I need to modify my paper in some way. So I don't know, because I'm kind of looking at this and it's like, I don't really see a good way around it. I can think of, I have a useful device here. Just give me like one moment. Mm-hmm.
I guess like people will accept religion and stuff because it promises a good outcome.
Right.
Preaching this would be difficult because it's like, what do you get at the end of it? Nothing.
So I have a very useful device.
Yeah.
It is my naturalism hat.
Okay.
So if I were a naturalist,
I thought it was a Trump hat, bro.
make naturalism great again.
Yes. All right. It's like, if I were, I made this hat long before the whole MAGA thing. I don't get a chance to use it very often.
I get it. You're a hipster.
All right. So if I were a naturalist, how would I attack this argument? Now, here's how I would attack this argument. I would actually say that externalism is the salvation for naturalism. Because if anything, the defeater thesis uses internalism. Here's how I would say that. I would say that scenario S1, R is defeated there. Because remember, I had this whole premise thing. I would say R is defeated in S1 where Sam ingests drug XX. But if I ingest drug XX, then R is not defeated for me. Here's how I would do that. I would say that, well, if it is the case that I have the blocking gene, then, and I still have this intuition that my cognitive faculties are reliable, I'm still justified in believing that my cognitive faculties are reliable, despite my sort of like internal evidence to the contrary. That's how I would attack the argument.
Bro, I totally can drive right now. I'm fine. Like,
yeah. And my takeaway for that is that there's got to be some limit to that sort of thing. Because imagine if I believe, my hair's messed up now. Imagine if I believe that I ingested, drug XXX that has 100% chance of cognitive faculties being reliable. And now suppose that belief just happens to be mistaken. My cognitive faculties are reliable, and my cognitive faculties are giving me the intuition that my cognitive faculties are reliable.
Mechanical elves are real.
It still seems that even in that situation, that I wouldn't be justified in my believing my cognitive faculties are reliable. That internalism does really carry some heft to it. And so that would be my response to that objection. But that is the type of objection I would use if I were a naturalist. That's really the only way I can see way out of it. Because, by my license, a probability thesis is unassailable. I took an epistemic approach where mental states are effectively epiphenomenal, and I point out that given just natural evolution, you don't know which way that supervenience relation is going to go. So the probability thesis is pretty much unassailable. But the defeater thesis, I think that's where the real weakness lies. And I would use a kind of externalist epistemology in the way that I just did there.
We had a red hot crack at defeating that, but it didn't. I don't think we quite we quite shook it off the line there, David. I had you back when you dropped off there a few times. Had a crack at it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was just saying, Maverick, to David when you went to grab your Make Naturalism Great Again hat, that I think possibly the reason why this conclusion is not more widely spread is because if you look at something like Christianity or other religions, they talk about the unreality of the world, you know, and its temporariness, but they offer you something in return, like, okay, here's like a you know, an eternal salvation, something. Whereas this case that you're bringing here pretty much like destroys reality and perception of reality, but people are going to be like,
you're a
and now
naturalist.
what? Right. Okay, so I guess if you pair it with Christianity, it's like a combo, 1-2 punch.
Yeah, because remember, one thing to keep in mind is that this variety of the argument is probably not widely known. This is just a draft.
Okay.
And so what prompted me to make this argument is I saw a lot of objections to this argument, and they seem to be kind of missing the point. But to be fair, Plantinga, in my opinion, didn't argue it as persuasively as he could have. And that's why I took this mental states approach with epistemic probability. And then I proved these theorems about mental states being effectively phenomenal. And so this particular type of argument isn't widely known. But if it were widely known, and you know, the best objection I could go after would be the defeater thesis, like I said.
Okay. So I guess once the paper's out, more widely known, has been discussed more, then people will start to try to develop more sophisticated counter strategies against it, but it's still kind of relatively unknown. Kind of like when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu first showed up, you know, in America, and everybody was like, what even is this? But now people have like come up with like counter strategies.
Yeah, at first it's like Brazilian. Which martial arts is best? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Oh, I don't think that's going to work very well. They just like dominated the MMA scene.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, we're at the top of the 2 hours here. So I did the ELI like I'm 5, and we kind of got the explanation of it. Do you want to just take like a minute or two just to make your final concluding statements, whatever they might be, whatever you'd like to leave people with who have tuned in and stayed throughout this epic battle?
Nobody wants to go first, do they?
I presumed that you would, since you went first in presenting, but
I'm
okay with
again. All right.
First.
So the most important thing to remember from this debate is to subscribe to my YouTube channel and be a patron. I got Patreon and Subscribe Stars. That's the most important takeaway for this day. Okay, so
awesome.
To summarize my position here, the probability thesis says that the probability of our cognitive faculties given being reliable given naturalism and evolution is low, and a big reason for that is those naturalistic mental states theorems that I mentioned earlier, where given a physical state, on naturalism, given a certain physical state, no matter which logically possible mental state associations obtained, the outcome, the universe's outcome would be the same. And that's why natural selection is largely impotent to it, because no matter which of those mental state associations, the causal behavior would be the same. That's a big reason for that. And the second portion, the defeater thesis, says that the naturalistic evolutionist who sees that the probability thesis is true has a defeater for their beliefs being, their cognitive faculties being unreliable, in a way roughly analogous to having ingested drug XX. Though it's not a direct analogy. I had a series of analogies, a logically valid argument, where it's basically like, okay, where is R not defeated here? The structure was, if R is defeated in this scenario, then it's defeated in this scenario. So for a premise to be false, there has to be a premise where R is defeated in one scenario and not another. And there didn't seem to be any premise like that. And so the magic of logic, again, is that if the premises are true, the conclusion is correct, regardless of what else might be true. And so because the premises do appear to be correct, the conclusion is also correct.
Yeah, so my position was that I formatted this as a discussion for the reason that this is not my area of expertise. And so I think I did have some misgivings about the argument, which is something I discovered as I was preparing for this. In particular, a lot of my arguments against Plantinga's version simply wouldn't be effective against Maverick's. And so, no, I mean, I think I learned that there is certainly more research for me to do on the topic before I reach a final conclusion as to where I'm going to stand on this. And so for that, I appreciate the interaction, and yeah, I was happy to learn stuff about that.
Awesome. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in. And I know there are a lot more questions in here from Slam RN and Nick Burak. Sorry, we're not going to get to those today, but go to David and Maverick's channels and subscribe there. Tune into their next videos and you can ask away in those questions. And thank you to both of you and each of you for taking your time, Maverick and David, today to bring this new take on a contemporary problem or approach to a problem which has consumed and occupied the minds of thoughtful human beings for thousands of years, if we are to believe, in our senses and what they tell us about history and the world. But yeah, it's an uncommon conversation, but an eternal one and an important one. And I thank you and acknowledge you for dedicating your intellect, your time, your energy, your intelligence, your thoughtfulness, and your heart to this and sharing this with me today and with all of our viewers. Thank you.